Alright boys, today we're going to revisit this card right here, the RX 6700 XT. We're going to see how this card performs in our usual suite of competitive games, Warzone 2, Apex Legends, Fortnite, Valorant and PUBG in 2023. The RX 6700 XT is one of the cards which a lot of gamers like. Apart from having obvious clock speeds as advantages, it comes with 40 compute units, 12GB of VRAM, 96MB of infinity cache, but the best part is that this card just brings a really good price to performance. At the time of recording, you could actually get these cards for under $400 in Amazon, which is just insane value. Now, for our test today, we're going to be putting this card up on our Ryzen 5800 X3D setup. And at the time of recording, we have used the latest drivers and settings. SAM has been enabled in the BIOS. Do note, boys, that we are using the reference model here for the RX 6700 XT. And if you're purchasing an aftermarket card, you probably would have slightly better results in performance and thermals. And kicking things off, let's start with our Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2 synthetic benchmarks. Now, this isn't real world, but this is a good gauge for performance as this will be basically the same engine used on Warzone 2. This is 1080p and 1080p with ultra quality FSR. Now, for those who are unfamiliar, FSR is AMD's open source upscaling technology, which will boost your frame rate on GPU bound scenarios. Now, 1080p is doing okay in this scenario, although FSR definitely pushes those FPEs even higher, of course at the expense of long range visibility. Now try to focus on these three values, boys. Apart from average FPEs, one should also look at the gap between all these three metrics. At 1080p, you can already see that we are maxing our card out, and surprisingly, the same thing goes with FSR ultra quality. We are at 99% and definitely GPU limited in this scenario. FSR will give you about 30 FPS, but as mentioned before, it will be at the expense of your long range visibility. And because the FPS here is high enough, we will continue to use 1080p native for our real world testing. And for those who are wondering how it performs at 1440p, you can see that in this scenario right here, it's passable, but probably not competitive enough, so we'll probably pass on 1440p testing on this one. Okay, let's move on to actual Warzone 2, Al Mazrah, boys, and let's see how the RX 6700 XT performs on real-world gaming scenario. This is native 1080p, and due to popular demand, we have brought in average FPS 1% and 0.1% lows values here. Don't compare these numbers to other runs as they are clearly different. You can only compare these numbers with identical runs. As always, boys, we would recommend you monitor the frame time charge. This is the time interval between frames and would give you a better visual representation if our player is experiencing any stutters in game. The more erratic this chart is, the more stutter that the player is experiencing. With the map being broader and larger in Al Mazrah, you will notice that our FPS has dropped as compared to our synthetic test earlier. And this is pretty much expected. The RX 6700 XT continues to be maxed out and even using up to 160 watts of GPU power. Temperatures for this card sets at high 60s, which isn't bad considering that this is a reference card. The game utilizes a lot of our VRAM, sucking almost of that 12GB. Some of this is just allocated with a small portion actually used for the game. There are some minor stutters in this game, and this is pretty normal for Warzone 2 on bigger areas, which is clearly reflected with our 1% lows, which is less than 100. However, our FPS over here is pretty good, pushing to around 160 on open areas. One interesting point that I've noticed, however, is that when we are now in the final circles on the late game, those stutters seem to go away because the map is smaller and the frame times become more stable, and naturally would also give you higher FPS. Meanwhile, our 5800 X3D performance is as expected, going up all the way up to 50% usage and running just below 70 degrees Celsius with CPU power going above 80 watts sometimes. Overall, the Warzone 2 experience on this card is definitely great. I think this works well as a 1080p card if you are a really competitive gamer. Reaching 200 plus FPS for competitive settings. You can obviously use FSR if you want to have that extra boost of FPS, but probably isn't recommended for Warzone where long range visibility is essential. Next up is Apex Legends. As always boys, we are using competitive settings here based off Albo performance recommendations. And what I can say is this is a pretty good experience. The RX 6700 XT continues to push frames here at 1080p, reaching that 300 FPS cap. GPU utilization is obviously maxed out on open areas at around 98% and way lower on interiors. Frame times in this game definitely is pretty stable. Even when we are looking at wider open areas, the frame times remain really good, consistent and stable. 1% lows here is around 200 FPS, and as always we will just disregard the 0.1% lows as this is usually related to any server issues. In Apex Legends we are only using 5.3 gigabytes of VRAM, and similar with our Warzone experience, GPU power is at around 160 to 170 watts with temperatures just below 70 degrees. There's not much to say here. With the 5800 X3D, CPU utilization is around 40% with temperatures at less than 70 degrees. CPU power likewise is just below 80 watts. And before we proceed boys, if you find our testings helpful and you'd like to see more, please subscribe to the channel. We would really like to grow the channel so we can do more of these tests. Let's move on to Fortnite. Like before, we're going to start off with our synthetic benchmarks here using all three APIs, which include DX11, DX12, and of course performance mode. The results are really interesting. With the RX 6700 XT, we find that DX12 will max out your GPU utilization even at 1080p, whereas DX11 performance mode is just chilling at 70%. DX11 so far gives you a more stable and consistent experience. It has overall lower average FPS but has better 1% lows, which is really close to your average FPS. This will mean it will have better stability on frame. DX12 tends to be better at the average FPS but has a huge gap when you're related to 1% lows. And finally, performance mode is pretty inconsistent and seems to be all over the place, with 1% lows way lower compared to DX11 and DX12. Even though performance mode has the worst performance amongst all three, I'm pretty sure you guys will want to see how it performs. And here we are. So on a real world gaming scenario, 1080p performance mode, we can see that it really mimics our synthetic taste. Our average FPS and FPS are very high at 400 to 500, but frame times tends to jump, which contributes to inconsistency here. As mentioned before, disregard the 0.1% lows in any of our real world gaming benchmark, as the results here is really sensitive to server issues. And like our synthetic taste, GPU utilization is around 70%. VRAM is only using 1.8 gigabytes with GPU power around 65 watts. So when you compare this to our DX11 experience, you will see that DX11 does have lower average FPS, but 1% lows tends to be closer to the average FPS. Now, although this game will have some form of stuttering issue, random, we have less stutters here or time spikes here as compared to performance mode. Moving on to Valorant, we'll start things off with some synthetic benchmarks again, and we're here with 1080p competitive and low settings, and from here we can already see that there isn't much difference between low and competitive settings at 1080p. For the sake of comparison, let's add 1440p competitive here, which maxes out our GPU utilization on one section, but overall it's pretty solid experience. Okay, let's move on to real world gameplay here, and same as before, we haven't enabled the average FPS 1% and 0.1% metrics here because Omen's ability seems to affect those results. At 1080p competitive, this is pretty good experience. We are definitely running 500 plus FPS on maps like this one. GPU utilization is only at 70% and only using less than 3 gigabytes of VRAM. GPU power seems relatively low as well at 100 watts, and like our previous Valorant test, frame times seem to be stable in this game. There are areas wherein frame times can spike, but this can be very minimal. At 1440p competitive, this is a viable experience too. In this map, it is more or less the same when compared to 1080p competitive. The only difference is that our GPU utilization and power can be a bit higher at 1440p, with power sometimes going up to 150 watts. But if you're wanting to play play at 1440p and you wouldn't mind a higher GPU usage or power consumption, this is actually pretty feasible. So yeah, go for that one with the RX 6700 XT. In PUBG, we have used competitive settings here, which is mostly low apart from anti-aliasing, which is set to high. And even at 1080p competitive settings, our GPU is maxed out here. Yes boys, the RX 6700 XT is at 99% GPU utilization in PUBG. Even in a small map like this, our GPU easily maxes itself out. FPS is very good though on small maps like this one at around 260 FPS and can even reach 300 FPS. Unlike before, just disregard 0.1% lows as this could be a network or server issue. GPU power is very high in this game, going all the way up to 175 watts, which does affect our reference model's temperature going above 70 degrees. And I mean, it's high, but it's not really that high. And because this is a small map, we have also trialed this card in Vikindi, which is a more graphically intensive map. And in here we can see once again our GPU is maxed out, but our FPS is now dropping to around 230 FPS, which is still good. GPU power remains the same and still pumps close to 180 watts. VRAM is sitting at 3.5 gigabytes. There are frame time spikes in here, which we believe is due to the game's engine or the server. This is a relatively good gaming experience. FPS is definitely up there for PUBG with the RX 6700 XT, and I definitely can't complain. Overall, the RX 6700 XT remains to be a good choice for gamers. It continues to push FPS with solid overall performance on our competitive games. Pricing on this card has come down since it was released, and you can now snag one of these ones below $400 USD. And speaking of a good price, do you know that you can build a gaming PC at around $500 with all brand new components? We have recently done a video right here. If you want the best banger gaming PC, click that video and we'll see you guys over there.